breaking the wall of resistance to change. How behavioral decision theory enhances technical and social innovation. Elke Weber, Columbia Business School, New York.
On November 9th, 1989, I was in my apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline and Lake Michigan. Then a friend called and told me to turn on CNN for coverage of the Berlin Wall opening.
I am delighted and very honored to talk to you today about how to break down the walls of behavioral resistance to change. Much of this work actually is jointly with my colleague Eric Johnson, who's in the audience. But before I get started, I want to ask you to do a little experiment for me. Okay, I want you all to get up. Now, I'm not actually going to ask you to actually do this, but I'm going to ask you to consider my request for you to change your seat, to move somewhere else in the room. Just monitor for a second what goes through your mind as you think about, will I move or will I stay? Sit. What I'm going to talk about for the next 14 minutes, this can't be possibly 11 minutes, okay, is inertia or status quo bias. If you come up with a technological or social innovation, are people actually going to adopt it? The answer, unfortunately, more often than not, is no. It also happens at the personal level. We all know that we should exercise more, that we should eat less, that we should reduce our carbon footprint, but it's very hard to do. It's hard to do for multiple reasons. Change is hard, the costs come up front, the benefits are down the road and somewhat probabilistic. Change is scary. It involves uncertainty and risk, and we are risk averse. Also, change requires self-control. We have to overcome our aversion to the immediate costs. What determines how much self-control we actually exert? Is it a function of our personal characteristic, or is it a function of the situation in which we find ourselves? Well, as in most situations, it's a bit of both. So let's start with the personal characteristics. There are indeed strong individual differences in self-control. There's a beautiful study the psychologist Walter Mischel conducted at Stanford in the 1970s. He brought in little 5-year-old children and he put a little plate with a cookie, a single cookie in front of them. He says, you can have that cookie anytime you want. But if you're willing to wait for a few minutes until I come back, you can have 2 cookies. Some of these kids managed to wait. Some of them succumbed to the temptation of the immediate cookie. 30 years later, those children who actually managed to wait were much more successful in school, in their careers. They made more money. They had happier marriages. There's a brain area that's involved in self-control. It's the area right underneath your temples, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. When we, and we've done this in our lab, actually disrupt functioning of this area, people become much more impatient. It's a good reason to wear helmets when you go bicycling. You want to have to maintain that area. And turns out that this activity in the area and also the connection of this area with other parts of the brain is partly genetic, and therefore some of us are better at self-control than others, and there's very little we can do about that. Fortunately, situational characteristics, the power of the situation, also strongly influence how forward-looking we are. And that's something we can manipulate, we can change, same way an architect would change the outline or the outlay of a building to facilitate different types of behavior. So we talk about decision architecture, how to structure the situation so that we, all of us, can be more foresightful and less impulsive in our choices. Let me tell you for a second about query theory as a blueprint for such decision architecture. This is a theory that Eric Johnson and I developed in our lab. It describes at a process level how people decide between different courses of action. When you had to make the decision between staying in your seat or moving somewhere else, what went on in your mind? Well, we've shown that this decision involves a process of arguing with yourself. You ask yourself, what's good about staying and what's good about moving? And depending on which of these queries provides you with more evidence, staying or moving, you choose accordingly. You choose on the basis of the evidence. This is not necessarily, or most often the time, a deliberate process. This is something that happens naturally and automatic in your brain. It's quite important that these queries are issued sequentially, because the order in which we think about option A, staying, or option B, moving, matters a lot. It matters a lot because the first query generates far more evidence than later queries. It has something to do with when you think about what's good about staying, there might be the occasional reason that comes up for moving, but you're saying it's not quite your turn yet. You suppress them. As you then move to considering the other option, they're still under the carpet. They have a harder time coming up. Output interference. So obviously, this suggests that it's a really, really important question to know which option gets considered first. And one important answer to that question is it's the status quo. When the status quo is something you've been doing for a while, like you choose your seat probably for a good reason. There might have been a label on your chair that said sit here, or you're the neighbor that you wanted to talk to. It makes sense to think about what's good about our existing state of affairs. And then think about alternative options. Other times, actually, we can assign people a new status quo. And this might be one of the entry points for decision architecture. How do we do that, and when should we do that? We do it as legislators, oftentimes the hard way. We legislate away inferior options. So yes, we cannot buy heroin on the open market. And no, in Germany, you can no longer have the traditional light bulbs. We now all have to switch to CFL bulbs. That's not so popular in some parts of the world that see these things as too paternalistic. But also, there are softer ways of making a new option the default, the option that you will get unless you take an active decision against it. Let me sort of show you by an example what I mean by decision defaults. In the case of organ donation, every country actually has implicit defaults. And these defaults differ by country. So some countries, Germany, the United States, are opt-in countries. You are not a potential organ donor unless you declare that you want to be one. But other countries have an opt-out policy. You are a potential organ donor unless you actively declare otherwise. What I want to argue is that the choice default that's in place strongly determines choices, and it determines choices, as we have shown in our lab, by which option the potential donor considers first. Do they think about themselves and being a donor and all the bad things that could happen with that in the opt-in case, or do they think about sort of what would happen to other people because they are automatic donors, and the consequences on them? Does it make a difference? Yes, there's a study in 2003 by Eric Johnson and Goldstein, and if you just look at Germany and Austria, sort of in the middle of the graph, Germany, the rightmost green bar, 12 out of 100 people in this opt-in country where you're not a donor, a potential donor, unless you declare otherwise. 12 out of 100 decide to end up being potential donors. Austria, very similar in many ways. Almost everyone in this opt-out country where you are a donor, unless you actively decide otherwise, almost everyone is a potential donor. This also is true not just for potential willingness to be a donor, but also for actual organ transplants. So that's huge social ramifications. What happens when we don't have an existing status quo behavior, and when we don't have a prescribed default in place? Well, labels really matter because labels make one option sort of more emotionally appealing. And so it turns out that people pay more for minced meat when it's labeled 75% lean than when the same meat is labeled 25% fat. Obviously, just two flip sides of the coin, but one is more appealing. I also want to show you quickly a decision experiment we did in our lab. It's a web-based study. People have to choose between an airplane ticket that includes a carbon fee, something that you can actually buy commercially on the web at companies that offer that, or the cheaper ticket without the fee. And the only thing that we vary in 2 or 3 pages of instructions that come right from these commercially available offset websites is we vary the label. Is this called an offset, a carbon offset, or is this called a carbon tax? As you can see on the slide, about 60% of our respondents, these are Americans, choose the inclusive option, including the fee, regardless of whether they're Democrats, Independents, or Republicans. As soon as you call the same option a carbon tax, and tax is a dirty word in the United States, you don't want to have any taxes, especially when you're a Republican, the proportion of people goes down to 27%. So let me wrap up by reflecting on what we have learned and how we can use that to facilitate change. Chancellor Merkel last year at this conference actually talked about old patterns of science and old patterns of politics and how they bog down our minds. Well, today we've learned why they bog down our minds, because our mind actually favors these old patterns. So knowing what we know about our natural short-sightedness and knowing what we know now about query theory, can we become our own decision architects? My husband and I just recently decided to become vegetarians after we spent 5 days with the Dalai Lama in India. We had great vegetarian food. And so we decided to change our default of what we eat to vegetarianism to reduce our carbon footprint. We did this by publicly declaring that we were going to become vegetarians. Notice I'm doing it again here. We also gave away all the meat in our freezer, okay, and we moved all the cookbooks for vegetarian dishes right next to the stove. And yes, we will probably eat less meat down the road than we did before. But change at the individual level is very, very hard. And so notice the story of Ulysses demonstrates that. Ulysses needed help. He asked his crew to tie him to the mast of his boat to resist the call of the sirens. Okay? So I want to end my presentation with a plea to the politicians and to the policymakers in this room. What I want to suggest is that you have both an opportunity and a responsibility to set wise defaults for us, the public. You have to help us to achieve our long-term goals. You can do this in relatively simple ways. You can make the socially and individually beneficial and responsible options the defaults in situations like building codes or other infrastructure decisions that will involve energy and transportation. You might actually encounter opposition to that, because as we know, the public does not like change. The human mind does not like change and reacts to that, negatively to that change. But ongoing research in our lab actually shows that the public opinion comes around after a few months or a year when you change something, because the initial change is being perceived as a new status quo. It just takes some time to do that. Chancellor Kohl and President Gorbachev showed this kind of political leadership when they helped to bring down the Berlin Wall. We have many other challenges of that sort. We have to bring about both technological and social change in many other domains. And I just want to finish by thanking you for your attention and by leaving you with the assurance that if you change it, they will like it eventually.